So we're waiting for Ellie to join us. She's the first speaker. And then we have Nada and Federico, who are already here. There she is.
Hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I can.
So I'll make you guys all co-organizers, just in case you want to share something from your screen. Sure. There you are. Sorry, you're going to see people coming in, but don't worry, I'll be dealing with that. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I think we can start. So as you,
Sorry.
Oh, that's you, that's not me. That's good. Okay, so as you know, guys, you have 10 minutes to present your papers, and then we'll have some time for discussing them all. So as you may imagine, I'm not Matteo Cherry. I'm sorry for that. He would have been a better chair than I am, but you're stuck with me. I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm not going to steal any of your time. We're going to have 3 papers, and they're all related. So the issue is a very interesting one, and I'm looking forward to hearing your talks. So first is Ellie Lasater-Guttmann, and her paper is on the supposed irreversibility of brain death. So Ellie, whenever you want, you can start. Thank you.
Sure. It's lovely to be here virtually. I had been very excited to be here in person, but this is also an answer. I'll share my screen. I've learned through these Zoom presentations that I have a tendency to, hold on, it's hard to speak and do this at the same moment. Actually, I think what may be easier, I have a tendency to scroll as I speak through a handout. And I've only learned that after I received some pretty critical feedback about how it was difficult to read what I was saying because I was just scrolling back and forth while I absentmindedly. So this is probably a better answer. Give me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my handout in the chat just in case anyone would like to see that way. It's not particularly, you know, I'm going to be saying essentially what I've written here, so it's not much to be concerned about. Give me one moment to get it in here. Strange, it's not letting me put it in. I think I can just share my screen then.
Ellie, if you wanna share it with me, I hope I can put it in the chat.
Oh yeah. Here. Do you mind if I email it to you quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, I've just emailed it to you. This is a lot of hullabaloo for a very simple handout, but that's okay. Sometimes it's easier to have something visual. And I'll begin talking while it's getting circulated through the chat. So I'm excited actually that we are engaging in a conversation. These papers seem to be very related. I haven't in fact presented this paper at a time when any other paper at a conference was related to it in any sort of capacity. So it's going to be interesting to be part of this discussion. What I'm going to be talking about is, as the paper is entitled, the supposed irreversibility of brain death. And interestingly, I'm not actually going to be doing much discussion about brain death itself or what brain death is. But I will say, as I say in the top of the handout that you'll see, that most of the discussion about brain death has been about cases of possible reversal. So a patient who at one time satisfied the diagnostic criteria for brain death, and then at some future time may no longer satisfy those diagnostic criteria. And I think many of us here would have read those cases. And so most of the discussion inspired by cases like that has been around what are these diagnostic criteria? And then is brain death death? That second question is the primary one of ethical concern. And then when we're thinking about the second question, a centerpiece point there is the assumption that brain death be irreversible, because we assume that death is irreversible. And so we have this question of, is brain death irreversible? If yes, then it's a live option as being one of the types of death. And that assumption itself, this concept of irreversibility, is the thing that I'm trying to put my finger on. We talk a lot about death being irreversible, whether or not death is irreversible, whether we think that this is incorporated into our concept of death or our medical usage of death. And I actually think that it's underspecified what we mean by irreversibility at all. So to begin, I'll start with some assumptions. In this debate itself, I stick with this concept of death being a natural kind, a biological kind specifically. And a previous definition by someone else has been that death is the irreversible loss of functioning of the organism as a whole. And similarly, I'm assuming that an organism is either alive or dead, and that switch between those two things is instantaneous. Obviously, those are related. And as I've said, the debate to date about what death is takes this form. Someone makes a claim like the following: a person is dead if her body is unable to fill in whatever physical process fill in whatever time frame. So, for example, a person is dead if her body is unable to generate heartbeats ever again into the future. And implicit here is this assumption about this time frame, the question of what does it mean for this to ever be able to happen again? What does it mean for death to be irreversible? And in the paper itself, I go into really stoking the fire that yes, we in fact do assume that death is irreversible. And we can see that with things like the dead donor rule, or the fact that we're comfortable cremating bodies, things like that. So just because this is easily the shortest version of this discussion I've ever done, we're just going to stick to a relatively small portion of this, specifically thinking about what one other person has said about irreversibility, and some possible options, and then I'll give my option. And there's going to be more in this handout than what I'm actually able to say here. So David Cole presents two options of what irreversibility could be. The first is what he calls strong irreversibility. And the concept there is that a person is dead if she has forever lost the ability to sustain some physical process. And this relates to any present or future medical intervention whatsoever. It's very broad. This is why we would say it's strong. And then we have weak irreversibility, second option, where a person is dead if her state is not able to be reversed by any current medical intervention available to her at the time of assessment. These are two things, and I can give more flavor here if anyone's interested, but two ways in which we actually do discuss irreversibility. These are common uses of this word, particularly in the context of death. But unfortunately, there are pretty strong objections to both. So the first objections to the strong irreversibility condition would be the concept of the issue of the doctor's epistemic access. Some people dislike the fact that if we're talking about any future medical intervention, then a doctor would never be able to know whether his patient is alive or dead. But then, in my opinion, more pointedly, issues about determinism in the future. Or determinism about the future, pardon me. So the thought of, is there a fact of the matter about what future medical interventions will be available? Is there a fact of the matter today? And if there is not, then there is no fact of the matter today about whether or not this patient would be alive or dead, assuming we're using this strong irreversibility condition. And that seems questionable. Particularly given that we want death to be grounded in this patient's body, and the body is, in its state in front of you. But we also have objections to the weak irreversibility condition. So a classic being the issue of the distribution of medical resources determining the state of a patient. So I'll give what is for me a very fun part of the paper, but has to be 3 sentences here. This twin case where we have 2 rooms, one room with an open door, another room with a closed door. And we have two patients with identical physical states in those two rooms. And those patients are, their states are such that if they are not revived by their doctor, they would be classified as dead. We would use those, just stoke your intuitions there on what that means. But if we're using the weak irreversibility condition, where a person is dead if there's no intervention available to her at the time, then the person in the locked room whose doctor can't access her would be dead. And the person with the door within the open room would be living, even though no medical intervention has actually been done to either of these people. The thought is that simply their state is determined, their life or death state is determined by the possible medical interventions that could intervene upon them. And that seems questionable. So unfortunately, because there isn't much time here, I'll give my own proposal quite briefly. But in my opinion, irreversibility, the strong irreversibility condition, weak irreversibility condition, both seem to slightly miss the point. And what we should be talking about is the modality of this word, irreversibility. And so my definition is that irreversibility should be read as it is physically impossible for a patient's state to be reversed at that contemporaneous time. And then a state is then irreversible if there are no physically similar worlds, meaning those worlds that share the natural laws with the actual world, where the patient's state is reversed without violating the natural laws. And I can go into cases about how this would play out, but I know that I have maybe 30 more seconds. So I'll just say some positives and then some objections that some people have against me. So I think that this is a good proposal, first because we don't bind the patient's life or death state with anything about the existence of medical resources or distribution of medical resources, about we don't bind it in whether or not the doctor knows about the patient, which seems to be a very strange thing to relate to the physical state of the patient. And we don't have issues associated with future facts. There are two main versions of objections against me. The first of which is a very nitty-gritty, philosophical metaphysical one, which is that I assume in this definition, I assume that natural laws can be violated. Like the type of thing that natural law is such that it can be violated. And of course, not all concepts of natural laws involve that violatability. And so, I can go into more detail about that if anyone's interested. I think the more pressing objection is, what does this mean for our treatment of patients? For some people, they feel very uncomfortable with the fact that, according to my definition, a doctor can't know whether a patient can be revived or not, or a doctor can't know whether a patient is living or dead. And what I say to that objection is, in fact, and I'll say one more sentence about why that would be true. Because a patient's life or death state would be determined by what's possible, and what's possible is determined by physically similar worlds, a doctor doesn't have epistemic access to all of these physical similar worlds. So a doctor wouldn't be in a position to know the life or death state of the patient at all times. Some people find this really unnerving. How would a doctor be able to do anything if they can't know? And for me, I actually think that the way that we use irreversibility generally misses the idea of a doctor being able to know, unless we're using this thing as a very casual term. Generally speaking, can a patient come back from the dead? Well, a doctor wants to say no, but typically speaking, what a doctor means is like the equipment around me isn't going to do it. I think something like that. So at least we need to be bringing what this concept of irreversibility is into question. I'll stop there. There's much more to discuss, but we can hold it for now.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was really, I know, a small version of your paper, but an interesting one. And I think we're going to have some time afterwards to discuss it also, after hearing from Nada and Federico, who have related issues as well. So thank you for now. So now is Nada's time. So Nada Gligorov, and her paper is very much related, as I mentioned, and the title you see now is Death Irreversible? So we see the slides, so whenever you want.
Great. So actually, it will be very related. In fact, I think we sort of agree. So this is this is a paper that's sort of forthcoming in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and it's going to be a very abridged version of that paper. So I'm going to like go through the motions and do the argument, but I won't be able to elaborate on a lot of it. So I won't tell you what inspired this because I actually say it in some of the other slides, but basically in this paper, or this presentation, what I want to say is that death actually is irreversible, or that the concept of death is irreversible. And I will argue that it's irreversible because death is an a posteriori notion. So in order to figure out what death is, you sort of have to have an empirically based concept or idea. I also argue that the definition of death does include irreversibility because the actual phenomenon of death is irreversible. And then I show, sort of agreeing with Ellie, that the scope of irreversibility, basically because the notion of death is a posteriori, is actually limited to physical possibilities, and that's the appropriate scope of the concept of death. So this is one definition of death that Ellie mentioned before, and people disagree actually on the definition of death. So I won't really. It doesn't really matter whether you agree with this particular definition or not. This is just sort of to give you the structure. So death is identified with something like the irreversible cessation of the functioning of the organism as a whole. And so to show you that death is an a posteriori concept or not a notion, in the paper I give a number of different arguments, but here I basically just sort of, what I'm trying to do is basically utilize an oldie but a goodie argument by Sol Kripke about empirical or a posteriori identity. So his argument was that something like water is equivalent to H2O is obviously an empirical discovery, something that you have to do some chemistry to figure out that water is H2O. But that identification, even though it's empirical, is kind of a rigid designator, meaning that it's true in every possible world because the meaning of the term water basically is set in the actual world and then basically is true in every possible world. So every world that you can think of, you don't have to think of them as worlds, but if you think of contemplating possibilities, water, or what the world could have been like, you can just say that all of those ideations or thoughts that we have about water, or the way in which we conceive of water, is basically limited by our actual conception of water in this world. That is basically that water is H2O. So my argument is that death is similar to that. So it's a kind of a biological notion that is fixed through some kind of empirical discovery, through knowing enough biology and knowing enough what it takes for an actual organism to continue to function. And that meaning of the word death then becomes a kind of a rigid designator, meaning that it constrains our contemplation or ideas about the possibilities for death and what death could be. So it's, in a sense, one could argue, if it's inconceivable for water to not be H2O, then it might be inconceivable for death not to be reversible. Okay, so obviously we have much more certainty about the identity between water and H2O. We don't have as much agreement about the concept of death and what is required for death. So what's my argument that identity or that Kripke's argument should apply to death? And so I have a number of different arguments, but I'm going to try and keep it on time and just give you actually an actual historical example of why I think that actually death is set by biological theory. So here I'm in a sense responding to some of the permanent debates that exist, in particular in the brain death literature, where people are constantly sort of juxtaposing the common sense notion of death with the scientific notion of death, saying that, in a sense, some people argue that the common sense notion of death and the scientific notion of death are not compatible, and in fact that the common sense notion here leads the way, or ought to lead the way. And my argument, in fact, is that the common sense notion of death very much includes biological facts and is in fact founded on some of the ideas that we do get actually from biology. And one example for that is, for example, the cardiopulmonary criterion, or cardiac death. That particular criterion is often characterized as the traditional notion of death, or the kind of death that everybody understands. You lose a heartbeat and you know that the person has died. But in fact, historically, this was not the first criterion for death. The first criterion for death was putrefaction. And the reason why physicians now can use the cardiopulmonary criterion or the cardiac criterion to identify death, or the way in which that criterion was established, was through the invention of the stethoscope. So obviously the development of enough biological theory to identify the heart as being one of the required organs for the function of the organism as a whole, but also the measurement that allowed physicians to identify the particular moment of death, or to precisely identify the loss of cardiac function, or to detect its presence. And so once that happened, then the criterion for cardiac death was established. And now everybody thinks of that as being sort of the traditional notion of death, because it's been incorporated into our common sense to such an extent that it's how we think of death. And in fact, one of the reasons why people think that brain death is not intuitive is because the person still has a heartbeat. Okay. So as was already stated, there is kind of a debate about irreversibility. And so the debate, I don't really much, I'm not really commenting here on whether the epistemological issues about whether or not the physician has access to or is able to know whether somebody has died, but basically just sort of with the notion of irreversibility and whether it belongs in the concept of death. So Bernat has argued that any conception of death has to include irreversibility, because his view is you sort of gather intuitions that most people have about death. And so irreversibility is part of those intuitions. And so that should be the basis of our conception. Cole, on the other hand, has argued that actually there's a difference between the common sense notion and the scientific notion of death, and that that brain death, or the scientific notion of death, introduces irreversibility, whilst in fact the common sense notion doesn't have that, doesn't include irreversibility, because people can think of, or sometimes even speak of, death being reversible, let's say through resurrection. He cites other things, or sort of like these broad possibilities about death being reversible in all these various ways. And so that his argument is that irreversibility is sort of this newfangled scientific introduction into the conception of death. And so the reason he says that death does not, the common sense notion of death does not include irreversibility is because he says it's conceivable for death not to be irreversible. And we can think of all these examples of people being resurrected, or maybe just one example of resurrection. And so then I thought it would be a good idea to explore what are some of the possibilities that could allow, or like what restricts our conceptions or the conceivability. And it seems to me that more or less the notion that Cole is using is sort of this idea of logical or metaphysical possibility, so that it doesn't really cause a contradiction to think of death as being reversible, or that it's somehow metaphysically possible for death to be reversible. But I think that is actually, if you think of death as an a posteriori notion, as I do, then the right way of interpreting irreversibility is by utilizing physical possibilities, which used to basically mean, people used to talk about physical possibilities as being basically relating to the laws of physics, but there's all kinds of questions about whether natural laws are actually laws, and also whether all of science can actually be reduced to physics. But basically you can sort of think of it as our best current knowledge of what is scientifically possible, or what is naturally possible for the body, or which processes are reversible. And so if the definition of death is a posteriori, then the scope of irreversibility should be based on those physical possibilities, not on logical or metaphysical possibilities. And one of the reasons why I decided to think about irreversibility in particular is because of this a paper by Raffaele et al. That came out in Nature in 2019, and they discussed this technology called BrainX, where they sort of successfully showed, or they think, so again, if you disagree with this particular experiment or the technology, that's fine. I don't care. It's not really important for my argument, but basically they argued that, they used a pig animal model, these pigs who had been basically decapitated and dead for almost 8 hours. And so they showed that using BrainX, you can reinstate some functioning at the cellular level. They argue, though, very vociferously that they did not restore brain function in the sense of no perception or consciousness was restored. So one could say, they said we restored some cellular function, but brain death remains basically an irreversible state. And so here I want to just sort of highlight the fact that when we're thinking about BrainX, what this does show is perhaps that there is a possibility or ways of changing the scope of irreversibility by knowing more about which types of processes are irreversible. So this time they didn't succeed in restoring brain function, but maybe in the future, this is a possibility that they could do such a thing. And that would basically mean not so much that death is not irreversible, but that the meaning of irreversibility trails these physical possibilities. And as those change, our notion of irreversibility changes. So is death irreversible? It is, but because it's an a posteriori concept, what that means can change over time as our knowledge of science and biology changes as well. So thank you so much. I hope I sort of stayed somewhat on time.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you very much. So now we have Federico Zilio for the last talk, and then we can discuss all of these issues you guys raised. So Federico is going to present a paper whose title is Unlocking the Brain, Neuroimaging, Disorders of Consciousness, and the Role of Neuroethics. So whenever you want, Federico.
I'm going to share some slides. Give me just a second. Okay. So now you should. Now I cannot see anything.
Yeah, just it's starting. I guess it would take a few seconds.
Yeah, but I have a problem because I cannot move anything in my computer. I don't know why.
Yeah, you're frozen right now. So your image is frozen, although.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I see you frozen and the slides are not coming up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can see you, hear you, and see the slides.
Okay, sorry for that. Okay, there was my internet connection that was not stable, as always. Okay, so yeah, thank you everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And yeah, so in my talk I will not speak of brain death actually, but on some states sometimes that is before brain death, that is disorder of consciousness. So first I will present the various dimensions and features of consciousness, in particular regarding detection of covert awareness in patients with DOCs, that is disorder of consciousness. Then I will present some methodological issues and ethical ontological issues regarding the neuroecological assessment of consciousness. And finally, I will discuss the role of neuroethics about this topic. So first of all, consciousness can be said in many ways. And here are some examples. We don't have, of course, the time to look at all these definitions. But for the main aim of a scientific understanding of consciousness is to operationalize experience, that is to to give a scientific definition through instrumental and methodological mediation. So subjective reports, psychological scales, observable behavior. The problem is that when we deal with disorder of consciousness, we cannot rely anymore upon subjective reports and psychological scales. So we need to rely upon observable behavior in states like coma, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, and minimally conscious state. Nevertheless, there are some cases in which the patient is completely unresponsive. It shows no communication and no motor functions. But this does not imply absence of consciousness necessarily, because they could be cases of covert consciousness, such as locked-in syndrome and cognitive motor dissociation, or fluctuation of consciousness, like in some cases of minimally conscious state. And so the aim here in this kind of cases is to find a neuroscientific operationalization of consciousness that is to empirically measures the level, the content, and even the form of experience. So the wakefulness state, the awareness, and the spatial temporal structure of experience, in order to find the neural correlates of consciousness. So those necessary and sufficient neural activation for the emergence of consciousness as such. And yeah, here, for example, some two well-known bidimensional and three-dimensional representation of consciousness in disorder of consciousness states, and where we can see that level, content, and form of consciousness can be dissociated one to each other. And we can imagine this with a metaphor, thinking about level of consciousness as the floor of an apartment, the content as the furniture, and the form as the arrangements of objects. So we can think about, for example, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome or vegetative state as an apartment with the floor but no furniture, or the minimally conscious state as an apartment with floor and some furniture, but with with a completely messed up arrangements of the objects inside the apartment. So the aim is to find the neurological operationalization of these dimensions. And sometimes we can think that it is now the time for looking into the black box of the mind, regardless of any other criterion and clinical assessment. However, there are some issues. And from the methodological point of view, there is still a high diagnostic error about unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And yes, neuroimaging can be of help to lower this kind of diagnostic errors, but it seems that there is an intrinsic risk of ambiguity and uncertainty about this use of neuroimaging, probably due to incomplete development of technologies, but also because of, can you hear me? Because Zoom is saying to me that the internet is
yeah, we can.
Okay, sorry. And, but also because of the way in which neuroimaging is used. And for example, one of the main points, the critical point, is the reverse inference used in this kind of assessments when we infer from the neuronal to the phenomenal. This is a good probabilistic tool, but one should be careful before inferring from a neuronal cognitive correlation to a neuronal phenomenal correlation, because we do a lot of unconscious tasks during the day, and cognition and consciousness is not always a unifying activity. So having cognitive activation is not the same thing of being conscious. So how to avoid this problem? Surely neuroscientists use multiple repetition of task, the comparison with task-evoked activity in mildly sedated healthy volunteers, and also they use specific tasks related to the autonomous will of the patients. and which are explicitly instructed not to follow the command of performing motor imagery, for example. So it is very related to the autonomous will of the patient. So in this case, we can see that neuroimaging can be useful, but they are not to be considered as substitutive criteria, but as ancillary and complementary tools for the clinical assessment. And from the ontological and ethical issues, there are several problems that I cannot put in details now, but they are all dependent from the background, which is a neurocentric background. The main one is the Brainhood Paradigm, that according to which we do not merely have a brain, but we are a brain, despite the common sense, and mostly in scientific domain, this is the very strong paradigm. So we are cerebral subjects, and this is also related to an underlying Cartesianism, in which the whole mind-body dissociation is now replaced by a brain-body dissociation. So the several problems are, from the ontological point of view, the neurological fallacy, the fallacy of simple location from a whitehead, and the confusion between having selfhood and having personhood. And from the ethical point of view, there are other problems like the anthropological dualism between conscious person and human beings, naturalistic fallacy from Moore, and the risk of dementalization and then of dehumanization. And how to try to overcome all these problems? It depends on the role of neuroethics. And in this case, I think that neuroethics should avoid the methodological ontological fallacy. That is, to avoid the translation from the neurological methods to ontological and normative determinations of the human being. This means that loss of consciousness or of sentience is not identical to loss of moral status. This is against some reductive functionalism, for example, Levin-Savulescu or Singer. And also that this means that clinical diagnosis should not limit cure and care towards patients on the basis of the level of consciousness. And also to avoid some vicious cycle in which the patient, the unconscious patient, is conceived as lacking personhood, so he receives less cure and then less chances of recovery, and then he remains unconscious and so forth. And the second point is that neuroethics should be very important to construct an ethical theory that is neuroscientifically informed, but not only based on neuroscience. So the first point is to avoid clear-cut moral distinction between conscious person and human beings, and whereas DOCs should be considered on a case-by-case basis. And also some neuroethical approach should promote a prudential and precautionary approach in which every single DOC patient is conceived as if it is or she is conscious. So against therapeutic nihilism and prognostic pessimism. And finally, if we want to go in that way, neuroethics should use an ontological personalist approach in which, according to which personhood is not an emerging property from certain contingent faculties like consciousness, but is an intrinsic condition of human existence, so also of the patients with DOC. And that's it. Thank you so much, and sorry for the rush.
Thank you very much, Federico. So I think now we can start with our discussion. Sorry for the noises, background noises. There are myself. So whoever wants to ask a question to our three speakers can just raise her hand or write in the chat. And also you guys, if you want to comment on the other's talk, you can certainly do so. So I know Ellie and Nada are pretty much agreeing on possibly almost everything, but if you have any questions to each other, that would be, yes, Federico, please.
Okay, I have a question about brain death. So both of you can try to answer. It's like more like an attempt to understand if I if I get this right. So if we want to use Kripken-like theory about brain death, so to think about brain death as a necessary a posteriori statement. Here an example that I want to show, I want to present, so that because I want to understand if I really get the thing. So that just think about the brain transplant, this very futuristic idea to be able to transplant a head or a brain, and just make this hypothesis in which we actually managed to cut the head, but during the process of the transplant, the head, the brain shows all those criteria that are related to brain death. But then after the connection with the new body, the brain regain completely all the functions. Okay, so with the Kripken-like theory of death, if I understand, that was no death. There was something different, because in that situation we have a reversible situation first, and so if it is not that, is like a new birth, or it simply is not a death. And secondly, when you, Nada, talk about a posteriori definition of death and irreversibility, I'm not sure, completely sure about how to use this, because Kripke says that, for example, the statement gold is that material with the atomic number 47, I think it is 47, I can't remember. That statement is necessary a posteriori. So in every possible world, the statement is true. Even if we find out that one day the gold that I have in my ring is not made of a 47 atomic number, but it has another atomic number, it means that it doesn't mean that this is that gold is not anymore the material with atomic number 47. Simply, this is not gold. For example, with the iron pyrite. So when you say that death and the irreversibility are a posteriori concepts, they must be also necessary a posteriori, because it is, if it is only a posteriori, it means that today is like this, and tomorrow it can be reversible, and tomorrow again can be again irreversible. But if you're saying that death and the statement that death is irreversible is necessary a posteriori, in that case, it means that even if tomorrow we can revive someone, in that case, that is not death, because the statement, according to Kripke, is necessary a posteriori, as death is irreversible. It cannot be changed. That case is another thing. Is like death one. Is like almost death. Is like something similar to death, but not death. But it is not death, because if you argue that it is necessary a posteriori, cannot change. So it can change by the way in which we measure it, but the statement is true in every possible world. So according to your vision, is death a posteriori statement or a necessary a posteriori statement? Thank you, and sorry for the confusion.
Okay, so there's a few questions in there. So let me see if I can get all of them. So the first question was about brain death, and so if you could sort of decapitate, so if you could sort of put like one body to a live head or something like that, is that sort of? Mm-hmm. So the definition of death that I'm using is of an organism, has nothing to do with personhood and whether the same person survived or not. So there are all kinds of possibilities one can think of where, you know, you can say that you have a live organism, but that one person no longer exists and now there's a different person. So I actually think I am a proponent of brain death as biological death. And I think that a lot of what is required for organism functioning is in a brain. And so you could get from that view that if you can preserve the head and sort of attach a body to it, that the person that would continue would be the person with the brain. But that's not related to my argument about death. The thing that you're saying about Kripke, yeah, I do think it would be a necessary a posteriori. However, what I'm saying is all of these things are a result of a discovery. So we could be wrong about the identity. It depends on whether or not we get the identity right. If we get the identity right, then you have a necessary a posteriori. So this is why I gave this argument about why I actually think that the common sense notion, or the notion that we use in everyday life, does trail the biological notion. And also I said that the scope of irreversibility can change. If we get all of that right, and finally sort of have like a complete biology and we know which processes are reversible or not, once we get to that point, we have these sort of necessary identities. I'm not saying that we're there yet.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have a bit more to say on that same front though, where just I want to lean in yet again to the fact that I actually don't think it's a problem in the types of cases that you brought up, not that exact case for the same reasons that were just discussed, but those types of cases that yes, that person would not have died. Whether there are a variety of cases, like for the BrainX case is actually a perfectly reasonable example, where I spoke to the I think truly revolutionary people behind BrainX and pushing them about, well, if in fact, you had not, the reason that there wasn't much electrical activity in those brains was because they had introduced, they had essentially hampered that activity with fear of certain fears and ethics concerns. And so I had said, let's say that it had all returned to full activity. How would you yourself have characterized what had occurred? And they themselves said those brains would not have been dead in the first place. And of course, like we have this question of the organism as a whole, whether those brains were severed from the bodies and these were pig brains. There are all these additional components. But I mean, even in the brain death cases where for people who feel uncomfortable with brain death as a diagnosis, and I'm one of those people, to show my cards, but for people who feel uncomfortable with brain death as a diagnosis, the regular characterization is not, oh, look, this, there's a famous case in the United States, this like 14-year-old girl, oh, she returned from the dead. So she's dead and now she's living. In fact, the way that most people characterize the case was she didn't die in the first place. And so I think this discomfort about, what you've said with gold, and in fact, my ring was never made of gold. I think that's actually how we would want to characterize most of these cases. That in fact, with more knowledge, we've learned that person wasn't dead in the first place. And we may have treated them as such because we have some sort of new death one that is socially constructed in some way or something along those lines. But that in the more strict sense that we're using, they weren't dead at all.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. So we have two more questions, and one is from Professor Michele Di Francesco. Please. Sorry, you're muted. The quote of the year.
Yes. Okay, as usual, Sara. I have a couple of questions. One is for Federico and the other for Dada, but probably also Ellie could be interested in the question if the question deserves interest, which is not certain. And Federico, it was a very rich presentation for 10 minutes. So you mentioned a lot of theories, but I'm a bit surprised that you don't mention Giulio Tononi and the theory of integrated information, because it seems an immediate answer to many of your worries about, of course, you may have a critical opinion about Tononi and Massimini and stuff. But what is your opinion about this kind of approach to consciousness and detection of consciousness? I think it's very, very interesting.
Okay, now I thought that I pressed the button. Okay, so thank you, Professor. And why I didn't speak about Tononi and the perturbational complexity index. I think that the PCI can only, for now, can only be useful for detecting some dimension of consciousness, that is the level of consciousness. Indeed, there are some differences in which we can conceive complexity in the brain, and sometimes Tononi is used to say that his PCI with Massimini simply reach every single details of entropy and complexity in the brain, whereas sometimes complexity and entropy is also related to noise, for example, and the brain death is one of these cases. So yeah, the interesting point of their theories is that we can try to knock on the brain with the TMS EEG technique and to see how the brain responds. And this is probably useful and is surely useful for the detection of awareness. But I don't think, or better, I think that they only detect a little parts of consciousness. For example, they don't see in a PCI that, for example, people in complete locked-in syndrome fluctuates a lot with consciousness. So they are awake, but they content in a temporal structural way, they continuously to fluctuate. And we are looking at this in our experiments with our lab in Canada with Professor Northoff. That is not so easy to define this. So, but my talking was not about technical stuff like this. It was even if PCI can detect all the brain activity and the correlation with consciousness, the problem is more ethical one. We cannot identify personhood with that brain activity, or to identify non-personhood with the lack of that activity, because in that way we result in to be stuck in a Lockean version of personhood that is quite dangerous, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. That would be nice to discuss about.
Yeah, a lot.
But anyway, maybe we can get in touch. So Nada, just an observation. I appreciated very much the approach. One thing that is, according to me, is difficult is to have a clear-cut distinction between the three levels: logical, metaphysical, and physical. It is easy to imagine some midway situation. I don't know whether you know the Minority Report, the movie, in which there is the possibility to forecast a criminal act is normally the death of a person. Then imagine that we interview and we make impossible the death, thinking this kind of fiction. Now, you can say, well, this is against our laws of nature, but how do you know that? The movie was comes from a novel by Philip Dick, which is the science fiction author, which was also a very good metaphysician. So I'm not so sure that it is metaphysical or physical or something else. So this was a short way to say it's very important for your approach to make to have a strong definition of, a clear definition of the physical aspects. And here there is the ample problem, you know, is our science or the future science? And this makes introduce some vagueness on the conclusions. But I hope to have been clear enough.
Yeah, I mean,
enough.
you're clear. I think that physical possibilities obviously would be narrower than metaphysical possibilities, because metaphysical possibilities, you know, it's metaphysically possible to have a unicorn. And so I'm not going to comment on Minority Report because I'm pretty sure I saw it, but I have absolutely no recollection of what happens in it. So I do think that the scope of the physical possibilities are narrower, and I think that they are based in what we currently are able to predict as a possibility. Yeah. Obviously, as those possibilities, so as we discover more and as we know more, those possibilities expand. So I actually do very much think that, you know, when people are talking about reversibility of death and all of those kinds of scenarios in movies, they tend to really be focused on metaphysical possibilities. And what I mean is really quite literally what we currently know, and what we could currently possibly imagine as a possibility for either reversal or how we identified reversible or non-reversible processes is basically limited to what we know. And what we could sort of imagine could be a possibility based on, I don't like the idea of natural laws, because again, there's lots of arguments against the idea that we should call them laws, or that they're certainty or necessity. So there's a variety of different arguments. So I don't think that they're laws, and I don't think we know them. So I think that obviously, one could argue, let's say, that metaphysical possibilities could sometimes drive discovery, but I think most of the time it's sort of people have hypotheses about what is a possible physical process, or they have hypotheses that are very much embedded in what is known about physical processes, and then that's what they use for discovery. So I do mean really scientifically based possibilities.
That's the question. How do you consider the statement in the next future, or in the future, science will defeat death? Is it a physical thesis or a metaphysical one?
I mean, it depends. So future science will defeat death, to me, would be a hypothesis, an empirically evaluable hypothesis. I think, you know, and I have absolutely no clue as a philosopher whether those things are really a physical possibility. But I would read it, if it refers to death, as an empirically evaluable hypothesis.
Yes, this one. Well, okay. I was wondering whether if this is connected with Ellie's observation that maybe there is the possibility of a change of the meaning of death.
Oh, there is. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is this debate about between reductivism and eliminative materialism, which is basically like, is it the case that, let's say, you can say death or a table or any concept. So if you discover new things about that entirely redefines our idea of physical objects, you can say, is it the case that there were no tables? Or let's say, is it the case that everything I thought about tables was wrong? So there are still tables, but everything I thought about it is wrong. So I think that particular debate, to me, isn't that important, but I would sort of err on the side of, you can redefine death and you can redefine irreversibility, and you can still use death as irreversible. And then ultimately in the future, it will identify entirely different states. It could.
Okay, so I think Ellie has a follow-up maybe on this.
So I had a follow-up. I also had just a new novel question, but I see that we're sort of coming to a close. So maybe it makes sense to let someone else speak rather than me.
Okay, so we'll let Federico Pizzetti.
Yeah, very quickly, because of course we are running out of time. My question is about the legal point of view. I'm a constitutional lawyer. So I was wondering if probably we need an irreversible concept or idea of death for legal question, for legal termination of personhood. Otherwise, I think that there will be some chaotic situation, like a person who is pronounced dead and the criminal should him or her be considered guilty if the same person after that could be, I mean, resuscitated, or about the wheels or something like that. So my point is, if we need an irreversible concept of death, at least for the legal environment.
I feel like I've said too much, so
I'll say what I said before, which was I think that there very well may be different types of death that we want to use, and that it may be particularly useful for us to think about a legal definition of death or a socially constructed definition of death in which we are comfortable continuing to cremate bodies, move on from them, mourn these death events, while also recognizing that there is some remote possibility in which this person could return. It feels to me like we regularly engage medically in our behavior. We treat patients, understanding that there may be some narrow possibility of some treatment working, but choosing not to provide that treatment anyway. We understand that there's a range of what possibility could mean. And so I think it's okay if some of our social definitions or our legal definitions are more stringent than what like the full range of possibility could actually be.
I just wanted to add that personhood and death shouldn't be thought of as the same, because there are actually people who argue that personhood and death coincide, so that death should be designated as the loss of personhood. But I don't think that's, in the US, that's not true in the law. So it's basically the death of the organism as a whole. So I just think we could decide to end life if a person loses personhood, but I think that they're sort of slightly distinct questions.
Thank you very much. So Ellie, if you want to just say the thing that you wanted to say, we can take a few more minutes.
Oh, I mean, it was a question not actually about this. The question that I had was probably 10 minutes ago. We were talking about whether there was this discussion similar to what was just said about how personhood should not be identified with the cessation of some set of biological characteristics. But what's interesting is, like, diagnostically, it seems hard to, I think a cessation of some set of biological things will always be involved in our diagnostic criteria. So if I'm thinking, has my grandfather passed away? Like, we can talk about death, we can talk about, but it doesn't have to be something as absolute as that. But, is he no longer this person? Let's not say death. Let's say cessation of personhood. Is my grandfather no longer this person for whatever reason? I think that we would, like, being scientifically minded, would want to return. Part of our criteria would be looking at certain brain states. And so I think it's interesting to think about whether or not, we may not want to identify these things, but it's not obvious to me what the difference is between having this set of diagnostic criteria, including that, and then having the definition include it. It's just not an obvious boundary, but I don't necessarily disagree. I think that intuition is a really great one. I'm just curious what it means when we're trying to diagnose someone. That's all.
I just wanted to clarify that I don't think that loss of personhood is not a biological state. I do think.
Oh, no, not you. Yeah. Federico earlier he was talking about this, or at least how I had heard was that, when we're talking about loss of personhood or some sort of loss of these metaphysical states, we shouldn't identify it with certain changes in biological state. That's all.
If you want, I can just try to clarify a little bit my point here. And we need to be careful not to confuse personhood with selfhood. And personhood can be conceived as a normative concept. And for example, for some philosopher, for example, for Spemann, personhood is actually related to a biological criterion, but it's not about the brain or the body, but to the human species. So whereas Singer said that not all the human beings are persons, and some animals are person, for example, for Spemann, all human beings, because they are species, they are part of the same species, are persons. So it is a normative concept that still relies on biological concepts, but not on that kind of brain activity or that clinical condition. And so the point is very, very clinical. It simply says that if you accept an ontological personalism, or when you have to deal with a non-responsive patient, you cannot have less cure and to have less care just because it is not conscious. But this kind of dehumanization is kind of relevant and sometimes frequent in hospitals, because you think, okay, maybe sometimes it also is like an unconscious process that you think that because it's not conscious, you can be not so gentle, not so kind. You can treat him like a piece of meat, and this is maybe an involuntary process that depends on a brainhood condition in which we think we are. That if someone is not anymore conscious because his brain is gone, is not anymore worth of some moral status, and we need to be careful. But this is normative thing. It doesn't mean that personhood is like some spirit that we put in the bodies. Is another level.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So thank you very much. I enjoyed myself a lot, which I mean, I know it's not relevant, but I did. So thank you for your talks and for the discussion. We also have a comment about whether life is irreversible or not as well in the chat, but I guess we should have another session on that. So again, thank you very much. It was a terrific session for me, and I'll see you all in a bit to Farhani's talk. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.